Today's video is presented by BetUS. Welcome back to College Football Addiction. One half, the playoff half of the Ruffino and Joe show. Also, Hack City Pod, is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Joe DeLeon on with us today to talk Notre Dame, Indiana. How's it going, Joe?
Great. And you made the really key important point here. And I know that you have Blake on all the time. The playoff half. His team's not in the playoff. So we there's no reason to talk about LSU, but of course we're excited. Marcus Freeman just got his extension. This is a huge game and what's going to be historic that South Bend gets to host the first ever expanded college football playoff game. Could not be more juiced up.
What's interesting about this one, Joe, is had it been last year, had it been a 14 playoff, now they're the 6th seed in the playoffs. They're ranked 5th, obviously because of auto bids. Would they have slid them in over the 4 seed? Would they have put Notre Dame's brand in? Maybe, maybe not, right? Like, would they have put, there were obviously different circumstances, but they're certainly not afraid to leave a big brand out of a 14 playoff. And so kind of fortunate that it fell this way. And then as good of a situation for Notre Dame as you could want, getting that home playoff game, getting to, I don't know, just take part in history. And maybe some of that mitigated just because you'd want like a weather advantage. I don't know if you're really getting that against Indiana. But yeah, like the vibes or the mood has to just be sky high. We were talking before we started recording about trying to get to a game like this. It's almost impossible.
Oh, yeah, that's the one negative downside of these on-campus playoff games. There's some universities and some of which that are hosting these first-round games. And I know Penn State Happy Valley is not an easy place to get to find a hotel. A lot of these ecosystems around these college campuses are super tricky. I know just from going to mid-season games, like last year going to Pitt versus Notre Dame, it was a pain in the ass trying to find a hotel room for my whole family to go and watch that game. So I can only imagine it's difficult. Probably have to stay an hour away for some of these folks. But outside of that, this is, and I think justified for Notre Dame, and it's truly fitting that they are hosting this first ever playoff game because of the historic connection to the sport, Notre Dame, what they represent, and the growth in the development of college football to become this nationally focused on and talked about entity and sport and what it is. It just feels so right that they are hosting this game. And then the other part about this, there's expected snow. You mentioned that there's not really much of a total home field advantage because Bloomington's 3 hours away, so they're used to the same cold weather circumstances. There's probably going to be a decent crowd of Indiana fans that are showing up to be in those stands. But this is exactly what we wanted from playoff football. We wanted to see teams hitting each other, punching each other in the mouth every single snap, trying to overwhelm and out physical their opponent with snow falling and snow on the field. It's going to be immaculate. And I could not be any more excited to see what the Fighting Irish do.
Yeah, we didn't get it last week in the Army-Navy game, but the snow game is coming. It feels like one of those gross Buffalo playoff games in January, so bring it on. And not to get too far ahead, I'll ask you about the game in a second, but Notre Dame with really not the worst draw. Like, people say, oh, focus on the game, but you and I don't have to play, so we're going to do this. But, not a bad draw when you consider, hey, you're going to be a touchdown favorite at home against the Indiana, and then you're going to play a team that might be missing their starting quarterback, and you've had time to kind of prepare for that. Now, conversely, Georgia's had time to prepare for him, the backup to play as well, and they're more than just their quarterback. But you'd certainly rather, anybody they can be down is great. And then if you were to somehow manage to get past that, the semifinal would not be against just you avoid the Oregon, the Texas, the Ohio State, the Tennessee high power, you avoid a lot of that. In all likelihood, it'll be Penn State. We'll see kind of how it plays out. But Notre Dame with really the side of the bracket that they could do some damage in. I will get right back to chatting with Joe, but first, let me tell you about our friends over at BetUS. The game right now is a 7.5-point spread, and you can go bet it using our code YouTube150. That gets you a 150% sign-up bonus. You get 125% on your next 2 deposits. All of that up to $2,000. Make sure that you're betting with BetUS.
Yeah, they were given – there's some contingencies that come into play here for Notre Dame and assuming that they play to their true potential. But you're right, they are given a favorable path compared to the other side of the bracket with Oregon, Ohio State, Tennessee, and Texas. There's just so many dangerous opponents over there that could get hot and go on runs. But for Notre Dame's case, they feel like they could be that team that gets hot and is underrated throughout this playoff field, especially because of the defensive presence that they bring in the matchups that they're seeing. It helps them against Indiana, whose offensive line showed a lot of weakness against Ohio State. It helps them going up against a Georgia team that you mentioned that has their backup quarterback starting. And Gunnar Stockton could be huge and play really well and have a Stetson Bennett type of a emergence here, or Jake Fromm level of impact filling in for an injured starter. Or he could struggle because he does not have a lot of playing experience. It's a bit of a wild card there. And then the last bit is Penn State. They have every capability to be a dominant team and reach the national championship, but we know that James Franklin tends to falter in these top ranked matchups and just fall short. It's not like I'm saying that they get blown out in these situations, but like we saw this season, they were just a little bit short against Oregon and just very, very short against Ohio State. So Notre Dame has that capability to beat out James Franklin that seems to struggle to prepare for these huge matchups.
In a year, and I was never for playoff expansion, but even I can admit that this is going to be a fantastic playoff that's wide open and so many teams that could go on runs and get hot and win this. And I know Oregon's 13-0, but I still know that there's a dominant team out there. Right. They showed some falters. Notre Dame playing some of the best football here late in the year. But I'll play devil's advocate to myself and then kind of try and get your thoughts on it overall. I think if we'd have said in August, hey, if Notre Dame goes 4-0 in November with wins against Florida State, who we thought was a top 10 team then, and a USC team that we thought would be, pretty good this year, they will, they are steamrolling their way into the playoffs. And they beat those teams the way they're supposed to, but we also kind of understand those teams weren't maybe what we thought they were going to be preseason. So Notre Dame playing some of the best football in college football, but how do you measure that in the grand scheme?
That's the duality of this Notre Dame team and what's been extremely frustrating trying to defend them. And I've tried to be really careful. I've tried to not say that, are you seeing the way that they played against Florida State? Are you seeing the way that they played against Army and USC? They're the best team in football. If it wasn't for the NIU loss, they'd be number one. I'm not going to jump down that rabbit hole because they don't have a tough enough of an opponent in this final stretch to really feel solid about who they are. They're doing everything that they needed to. And that's something that you and I have discussed when I've appeared on your channel before, is that they needed to blow out every single opponent that they saw. They accomplished that against all the teams that they faced, and they're doing it with such defensive dominance. Even against USC, who had massive production in the passing game, they still produced 2 pick sixes to close out that game and had a number of huge defensive plays that shifted and swung the momentum back in the Fighting Irish's favor. So I think the way that you have to analyze this is in seeing, when you watch the film, of, hey, they have a really talented secondary. They have a banged up defensive line, but it's really deep, and they're able to make huge plays against the pass, and they can play well enough against the run to slow down opposing rushing attacks. And on offense, their rushing attack is playing as good as it can be, and it's the best, I believe, backfield in the college football playoff, with Jadarian Price, Jeremiah Love, and Riley Leonard all being impactful as runners. With all of that, they have a shot to be a national champion this year. But the flip side, as we're talking about, is without being challenged, how do they respond to adversity? Can we actually believe the hype? Because there's plenty of times where we see teams that don't face anybody. Indiana is an example of this. The first time that they're actually seeing a competitive opponent, they might not be ready because they just don't have that experience on their resume and to know what those situations are like.
Yeah, Indiana, and I again, Rufino and Joe show, we'll link that in the description. Make sure that you go and subscribe there. I've got really just a couple of national shows that I do follow, and that is the one that I watch just about every episode of. So go make sure that you're subscribed there. But my favorite thing about bringing you on is that you're not just Notre Dame centric. Like, I think you really do have a good kind of idea. Not that you're, this, not to take away from it, but savant that knows every single in and out of every team. But I do think you have a great national perspective. And that's my favorite thing about bringing you on here, is I think you're pretty balanced on giving a pretty good objective opinion on the other side too, which is maybe tougher for people that are a beat writer for one team, or if your name is Blake Rufino. But all that said, Indiana, like they blew through everybody, and then kind of struggled against Michigan, very much struggled against Ohio State, and I did rebound well against Purdue, which again I don't know how much you put into that or not, but
Yeah.
Indiana's the same way, right? And so what they've done has been very impressive. No one expected 11-1. I'm not taking away from that by any means, but that's why this matchup is so interesting, because it's really who punches first, and all that considered, what are your expectations for Indiana in this?
I think the way that you described it, who punches first, is a really good way of just framing the general theme of this game, because Indiana also has a very talented roster and a really well-coached team that could surprise people, especially in this game. And it's not like they're traveling across the country for this matchup. They are and have this advantage of playing in a setting where there could be Indiana fans filling some of these stands. I'm actually really curious to see what that fan setting is going to be like, if it's mostly Notre Dame fans or not, and that could maybe help, not swing things, but impact the atmosphere. I think for dealing with Indiana, Notre Dame needs to play their best run defense. That was something that was not talked about and really underrated in Indiana's performance against Ohio State, is that they ran the ball decently well. Tyson Lawton had some big carries late in the game, but they got away from it way too early and tried to recapture their rushing attack way too late in the game. If they had leaned on it a little bit more, maybe the game could have been a little bit closer. And also some special teams woes that really killed them and made that game as big of a separation as it was. I also think, though, the biggest part for Notre Dame is they have to enforce and impose their physicality on Indiana. Indiana's offensive line statistically was one of the best in the country, but we saw that when they were facing their first matchup against a defensive line that was loaded, they were getting manhandled, especially against the pass. And that's where Notre Dame excels. They have the pass rushing unit led by Riley Mills and Howard Cross in the interior to get those pressures up the middle on Curtis Work, and they have the secondary to shut down a number of the receivers that this Indiana team has. Surratt is a great player, but he is not somebody who is going to really challenge Leonard Moore and Christian Gray in this game. Notre Dame needs to continue to create those turnovers with Don Schuler and Xavier Watts the way that they have throughout the entirety of the season. So I think that the defensive presence that Notre Dame has sets them up well in this matchup, but it comes down to, how do they start? Notre Dame loves to sometimes start slow in these matchups. They haven't done it in a while, but they can't start slow because Indiana is a momentum-based team that will take advantage of that.
Yeah, it feels like once Indiana gets things rolling, and it felt like they were kind of starting that way. You mentioned the Ohio State game. They were kind of started that way, and then it was just mistake after mistake. They were kind of answering Ohio State early, and then it was mistake after mistake, and that game got away, right? Like, it just, once they went down a few scores, it was going to be pretty tough. But I agree with you. I think Notre Dame's defense really is probably the difference here. And, not to take anything away from what they've done offensively, but it's tough for me to see a path where Indiana, I don't know, scores more than 21, especially if there's snow and there's, weather impacting. They could be under that. But I think if Notre Dame's defense plays well, it's tough for me to kind of envision the path of Indiana scoring several times in the game. But if there is a concern, or if there's hey, this is what worries me about Indiana, is it their quarterback? Is it O'Rourke? Is it what part of Indiana's game kind of gives you the most pause?
I think the one thing that might worry me the most is that rushing attack. Tyson Lawton, Justice Ellison are very, very impactful runners, and can play off of one another. Notre Dame's run defense is probably their weakest spot. It's not a significant enough of a weakness to completely take them out of the game. But if Indiana starts to establish the run early and starts to, again, not abandon it like they did against Ohio State, if they start to pick up those chunk plays and they start feeling themselves and think like, oh, we've got this, we're able to run the rock in the snow, that is the one thing that would make me a bit fearful. I'm not particularly worried about other facets of this team, but the only other piece on the defensive side of the ball is their pass rush. Michael Kamara has been one of the most productive pass rushers in college football. How does Notre Dame play against him? They have the guys that are better athletes than him, that they should be able to keep him in check. But if he gets loose and he starts to build confidence, that's another thing that could swing in momentum's in Indiana's direction for momentum.
Who is your X factor? Give me one on offense, one on defense for Notre Dame, and then we'll wrap up and get out of here.
Jeremiah Love has always been my X factor on offense, and I think that really applies in this game. Again, the weather conditions are going to mean that running the football is what will win the football game for either team. And Jeremiah Love, he is a spark plug. He is also very physical. He is going to be the best athlete on the field every time he touches the field. If he is able to have a 30-plus yard gain early on in the game, I think that is what is going to help Notre Dame secure this win, because they're going to realize, oh, we've got these guys. We can run the ball, and then they can turn to Jadarian Price the way that they do. Whenever he has success, Riley Leonard starts to have success as a runner. Jadarian Price starts to have success as a runner. It opens everything up. So he's the biggest. And then on defense, I think it's Riley Mills. I know that the secondary has been super important for their success, but Riley Mills has been on a heater these past few games, taking advantage of offensive linemen that just aren't physically big enough or strong enough to keep up with him. And he has been a mauler. He is extremely physical. And if he can get home on Curtis Rourke up the middle, that I think is going to be huge for Notre Dame's success, because the minute he sets the tone, the rest of the defensive line is going to follow suit.
Seems like you're leaning Notre Dame. I know it's kind of early in the week, but the game on Friday night, right? So not super early, a day earlier than it would normally be. Seems like you're leaning Notre Dame, but do you think they can cover the spread too?
It's a big spread. I believe it's 7.5 the last that I checked. So I'm not. This is a game that I'm not super excited to bet on because of how big that spread is. If Notre Dame plays to their potential and this game plays out like the Ohio State game, 100%. But because of the weather conditions, because both teams are going to try and run the ball, and I think that they're evenly matched in some areas, I could see this being a 5-point, 4-point, whatever it is, close victory for Notre Dame.
Should be a ton of fun. It feels like the season. I feel like these 20 days went pretty quick, and we're already there. And again, as somebody who was anti-expansion, I still can't wait for these 4 games this weekend, and then for the next. So, Joe, we mentioned Ruffino and Joe Show, but where else can people follow you and find your work?
You can catch me on Twitter at Joe DeLeone, DeLeone. And be sure to, as you said, check out Ruffino and Joe Show. We're live every Sunday, Monday, and Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. You can also catch the podcast version on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, just Ruffino and Joe Show. DJ, appreciate it as always. It's great to catch up with you.
Yeah, thanks, buddy. Good luck this weekend.
Thanks.